So before we start today, I want to tell you about what's coming up next week. If you've been wondering when is this series going to be over, it's over today. Congratulations. We'll move on to something else next Sunday. I'm starting a brand new series I'm really excited about. The series is called 5 Things God Uses to Grow Your Faith. 5 Things God Uses to Grow Your Faith. So if you're one of the people we've been talking to through this series and you've decided to reconsider Christianity, but now you're like, okay, where do I even start to explore faith? This is going to be very, very helpful for you. I'm going to unpack it over the next 2 weeks. And if you're a Christian and you have felt like, you know what, I just don't feel like I'm growing the way I should grow, I feel like I'm stuck in my faith, this is going to be extremely helpful to you as well. So this begins next week. Bring a friend to that. 5 things God uses to grow your faith. Now today, we're going to wrap up this series, Who Needs God? And if this is your first time, I just need to tell you, you are coming in at the end of a very in-depth conversation and discussion we've been having for 6 weeks now, and you may be missing a little bit of the context. Today will still make sense to you, but I hope today intrigues you enough as we're wrapping up this conversation to go, well, what have I missed? I'd like to hear a little bit more. And you can go to our website, journeycalway.com, and you can find all of the messages for here. You can subscribe to our podcast and get them that way, and you can catch up, because this has been a unique series. During the last 6 weeks, I have been talking directly to all of you who researchers call the nuns. And by nun, they simply mean this: you are the group of people who has migrated away from faith, migrated away from church or Christianity. About a fourth of all Americans now fall into this category, and you no longer affiliate with any religion. You don't affiliate with Christianity, you don't affiliate with atheism on the other end. You're kind of stuck in the middle. And I want to say a couple things to you before we jump in to today. One, I want you to know that for those of you who are nuns and you have been tracking with us through this series, and it's been a lot of you, I have huge respect for you. I am so grateful and so thankful that you have been willing to track with us, and I just want to tell you that. I think it takes a lot of courage. I think it takes a lot of intellectual honesty to reconsider or reevaluate some of what we've been talking about. So I just want you to know how much respect I have for you, and I hope, and I told you this at the beginning, this was my agenda, I hope that what has happened over the course of these last 6 weeks is I have convinced you, or you have, reached the point where you've decided that you should reevaluate or you should reconsider Christianity. And I think that's important for a couple of reasons. One, I hope you've decided to do that because of what we've talked about, that what you walked away from when it came to Christianity or faith or God may very well have been a bad version of Christianity, or it may have been a bad view of God. And it's worth it for you now that you're an adult to reconsider or reevaluate who the God of Jesus is, because he may be far more appealing than you realize. The other reason I hope you reevaluate or reconsider is simply this. I think, and this may surprise you, but I believe this, I think the church needs you. We need you. We need you involved. We need you here. We need your voice. We need you expressing your skepticism, your doubts, your questions, and your frustrations. Now, I can't speak for every church, but I can speak for this one. And you are part of the reason we started this church, and we want you here. We are not offended. We are not intimidated by your questions, by your frustrations, by your skepticism. We would love to hear those, and we would love to continue a conversation with you. And that is why it is important for us here that you know you can belong even if you don't believe. You may not agree with everything we believe. You may not ever reach a point where you want to embrace the God of Jesus, and that is perfectly fine with us. You can still be here. You can still belong. You can still be a part, and you have a safe place to express your questions and your frustrations. And I know our church is better because of it, and I think the church collectively would be better because of it if you were engaged. Now, today, we're going to wrap up with something. It's a challenge, and I'm just telling you up front, this is going to be really difficult. It's going to be difficult for all of us. It doesn't matter who you are. This is tough for everybody. Today, the challenge is this. I want to get you to be honest with yourself. To be honest with yourself. Now, you're sitting there thinking, well, that's not going to be hard because I'm good at being honest with myself. No, you're not. You're not nearly as good at it as you think you are. I'm not nearly as good at it as I think I am. The reality is, whenever I'm truly honest with myself, I tend to walk away with something to work on every single time, and I don't like that, and you don't like that, so we try to avoid it. Every time I'm honest with myself, I have to come to the conclusion of, I think I'm more the problem here than I would like to admit. None of us like that, so we tend to avoid it. But being honest with yourself, or sometimes this is called self-awareness, being honest with yourself is actually one of life's most important skills for this reason. Because self-deception always takes us in a bad direction, and it leads us to a troubling destination. Nobody deceives themselves into a successful life. That just doesn't happen, does it? Now stop and think about this for a minute. You know this is true. You've experienced it in your life. For some of you, your childhood would have been much different, much healthier, much better if your parents had had the ability to look in the mirror and to own some things going on in their life instead of deceiving themselves into believing they were not the problem and they were not the issue. You'd have had a totally different childhood if they could have looked into the mirror and said, you know what, I think I'm the problem and I need to change. Some of you would have never gone through the divorce you went through if one or both of you could have looked in the mirror, owned the problem, and said, you know what? I keep pointing the finger saying they're the issue. I don't think they're the issue. I think I'm the issue, and I think I need to quit worrying about fixing them, and I need to start worrying about fixing me. Some of you would have never gone through a divorce if that would have been true. And the same thing is true when it comes to faith. When it comes to faith. When it comes to the way you view or the way you embrace or your choice to walk away from Christianity, wherever you are in that, you have to understand the self-deception, it always takes us in a bad direction and it leads us to a troubling destination. Now, when it comes to faith and the role that self-deception plays in our faith, I was reminded of this about a year ago when I read a book by Thomas Nagel. Thomas Nagel is a professor of philosophy and law at New York University. When I say smart, I mean like smart. I was reading a little fascinating book he wrote called Mind and Cosmos. Mind and Cosmos. And here's the subtitle. This is all you need to know, okay, this is way over all of our heads. Mind and Cosmos, why the materialist neo-Darwinian conception of nature is almost certainly false. To which we all go, what does that even mean? I mean, this guy, I started getting in this book, and I'm like, good grief, this is deep. But here's what's so interesting about Nagel, and what I found fascinating about this book. Nagel is an atheist, but this little book made atheists so angry, so angry. There was so much backlash to him over this. And Nagel is one of the most well-known or leading atheists. But he wrote a book, and basically I'll just summarize this book for you. In this book, Nagel said that atheists are guilty of doing the very same thing that they accuse Christians of. In week 2, if you're with us in week 2, we talked about the gap God. I talked about how as Christians we have a tendency to take whatever is unexplainable and just to plug God into it to fill the gap. Whatever's unexplainable, well, that's proof for God, and there's no natural explanation. Then we find a natural explanation. It's like, oh, okay, well, and then we go to something else. Well, Nagel said this. Nagel said, as atheists, we're guilty of the same thing, only whenever there's something we can't explain, instead of plugging God into the gap, we plug natural selection into the gap. It's just our explanation for anything unexplainable. And it infuriated atheists. Now, you may not be interested in all of that, but it was a really, really fascinating, hard to understand, but a fascinating read. But this led me to learn a little bit about Nagel, and I came across a quote from another book he had written. And when I read this quote, I thought, oh my gosh, this is incredible. This is extraordinary honesty that is so hard for any of us to acknowledge and to express. When he was talking about the idea of self-deception and the role it plays in our views about faith, here is what Nagel wrote on page 130 of his book, The Last Word. He said, I want atheism to be true. Pause. Nagel said, I haven't just examined the evidence and come to the conclusion that atheism is true, that all the evidence points towards that. Nagel said, I'm going to go ahead and admit that I come with a bias, that I actually want atheism to be true. There's more going on than just an unbiased investigation of the facts. He said, I want atheism to be true and am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. I love this. Nagel says, listen, if I were honest, I've got to admit, I look around and some of the people I respect the most, some of the most intelligent, well-informed people I know, have apparently looked at the evidence and concluded that God does exist, and they have embraced faith. And it makes me uneasy. It makes me uneasy because I know there's more going on in me than why I examined the evidence and came to a different conclusion. I know that maybe I'm wrong because I just want atheism to be true. Maybe they're right. Nagel goes on, he writes this: it isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. In other words, he says, it's not just that I examined the evidence, I arrived at this conclusion, and now I'm hoping that I came to the right conclusion. He says, no, there's more than that going on. It's that I hope there is no God. I came into this hoping that's where I would land. And then he ends with this statement. He says, I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. I have so much respect for him. Most of us wouldn't even be this honest in talking to someone. He was honest enough to write it down. This is incredible honesty. This is a guy who understands, wait a minute, there is some self-deception going on in me. Now, I'm not just singling him out or singling atheists out, because this is possible for all of us. This is something all of us have been guilty of. What Nagel is driving at is there's a difference between two things. There's a difference between I don't believe it and I don't want to believe it. This is so important. Don't miss this. I don't believe it is, okay, well, I did an unbiased investigation. I examined all the evidence, and best I can tell, given the evidence I have looked at, this is simply not true. Either there is no God or there's not a God worth following, and I'm just going to walk away, move away from Christianity, from God, or from faith. That's one opinion. I don't want to believe it is something entirely different. I don't want to believe it is, you know what? I've got my reasons for wanting to walk away from God and faith, and now I'm going to get some facts, and I'm going to prop up my argument, or I'm going to build a case for why I can do the thing that I just want to do. These are two very different things. Now, how do you know which one is true for you? I'll tell you. People who say, well, I don't believe it, if you're up here in this camp, then you are open to re-examining new facts. You are open to re-investigating faith. You are open to re-examining your perspective or your belief system, whatever that may be, as new facts develop. You're always open to learn, and you are open to change your mind if new evidence comes to your attention. If you're down here, your very first response whenever someone makes a statement that's against your position is to fight it, is to resist it, is to rebel against it. Two very different things. So, what I want to do today is I want to talk about this dynamic, because it's something that all of us can be guilty of. And I want to ask you a question to start. And I realize up front, and just before I ask it, I'm going to preface this. This question could seem a little offensive. This question might get under your skin a little bit. This question might feel a little presumptuous, and I'm not trying to offend you. I'm not trying to be presumptuous. Remember, my goal today is to help you and to help me be honest with ourselves. And this question is one, if we're going to be honest, we have to wrestle with. Here's the question. Did you walk away from faith because the evidence was overwhelmingly against it, or because faith simply became inconvenient? This is a great question to consider. Did you walk away from faith because you looked at all the evidence and all the evidence was overwhelmingly against the idea or the fact that you should embrace God, faith, or Christianity? Or did you walk away just because it became inconvenient? In other words, did you walk away because you wanted to rebel and you wanted to resist, and then you needed to come up with a reason other than just saying, well, I'm rebelling, I don't want anything to do with it. And so you built an argument for yourself. Did you walk away because there were some things you just didn't want to own? Did you walk away because this required a change in lifestyle? Your faith would require a change in lifestyle you didn't want to make. Faith would require you to do some things you didn't want to do. Faith would require you to forgive some people you didn't want to forgive. And so it was just too inconvenient. It just didn't fit with where you want to go in life. And so you walked away, but you can't just say that, so you came up with some other reasons. And that's your public argument, but in your heart you know why you really walked away. The famous mathematician Pascal put it this way. He said, people almost invariably arrive at their beliefs not on the basis of proof, but on the basis of what they find attractive. This is so true for all of us. See, everybody says, I want to know the truth, I want to know the truth. Well, yeah, we want to know the truth, but we actually don't live our lives on a truth quest. We live our lives on a happiness quest. That's what we really all want. Isn't that true? In the end, we want to find what's most attractive. Like none of us are really going, you just show me the truth, and when I discover the truth, I'll change whatever I need to change in my life to follow it. That is not how we live. We find what makes us happy, and if the truth aligns with that, that's great. And if not, we'll figure out how to make our truth align with that. And the minute that that doesn't make us happy anymore, we're open to discovering or reevaluating truth. Pascal said, you got to understand, this is a dynamic that goes on in all of us because we're on a happiness quest. And so we will self-deceive very easily, which is also why, by the way, if you've walked away from Christianity, you need to understand this. This is one of the reasons you say you walked away, because Christians are hypocrites. And you are absolutely right. And you know why Christians are hypocrites? Because we aren't on a truth quest either. We're really on a happiness quest. And anytime a Christian believes that doing something against or out of line with God's design or against what God says, anytime a Christian believes following God's design is going to make them less happy than not following it, a Christian will almost always do what they want that's going to make them happy. It's why they're hypocrites. It's why we've all done it. Because ultimately, we tend to be driven by our happiness more than by the truth. I'm not saying that's the way it should be. I'm just saying that's the way that it is. Augustine, maybe you've heard of Augustine. Augustine of Hippo put it this way. We love the truth when it enlightens us. We hate the truth when it convicts us. That was his way of saying, hey, we're all about the truth when it works for us. We don't want to do anything to do with the truth when it works against us. Now, we all understand this. Just think back to when you were a teenager and you were arguing with your parents. Isn't this how it worked? You played the truth card whenever the truth worked in your favor with your parents. If it wasn't going to help you get what you wanted, then you pushed it aside and did not want to talk about it at all. We have all done this. So, when it comes to faith, this can be true for all of us, which is why I want you to think about this next statement. When we won't acknowledge what we suspect to be true, just stop and think about it. Like you look at the evidence, and the evidence seems to point one way, but you say to yourself, no, I don't want to acknowledge that. I don't want to give that any credence. I'm not going to give that my attention because I think it's going to lead me in a direction I don't want to go. When we won't acknowledge what we suspect to be true, or won't examine for fear of what we might see, I'm not even going to explore that. I'm not willing to even talk about it. No, I'm not going to listen. I'm not going to try to get answers. I think I've got it figured out, because if I explore, I might find something I don't want to find. When we won't acknowledge what we suspect to be true, or won't examine for fear of what we might see, it means something else is in the mix. And this is where being honest with yourself is so important. Because you have to acknowledge, maybe in my heart, something else is in the mix. You know, I said I walked away because of those hypocritical Christians. I said I walked away because of what they did and how they hurt me. I said I walked away because who can believe in a worldwide flood and a 6-day creation and Jonah in the belly of a big fish? And, I mean, all that stuff's just ridiculous. I mean, I walked away. It's what we tell people. I walked away because of all that. But is it possible that's not the real reason, that there is something else in the mix? What I want to do today is I want to take just a second to suggest to you that there could be a combination of 3 things that are in the mix that are the real reasons why you chose to walk away from God or faith or Christianity. And I'm not going to ask you to admit this to anybody else, but you owe it to yourself to at least be honest and admit it to you, because self-deception never leads to a good destination. The first thing is this. If there's God, if I turn around and I embrace God, then I'm guilty. That is a conclusion you have to come to. And is it possible that that is part of the reason that you walked away? Because you made some choices, you engaged in some behaviors, you went a certain direction in life that you knew was out of line with God's design for you, and you thought, if I turn around and I embrace God, then I will run smack into this emotion of guilt, and I don't want to feel that. I don't want anything to do with that. And so you walked away from God, not for the reasons you gave, but you walked away from God because you didn't want to deal with guilt. And instead of saying, well, this is wrong and I'm out of line with God's design, when we walk away from God or we walk away from faith, you know what we then can do? We can look at the choices we make in our life and we can say they are just, this word right here, mistakes. They're just mistakes. I made a mistake. Okay, well, you live and learn. All of a sudden, you can excuse a lot of your behavior. I can excuse a lot of my behavior if I don't have to face God, if I don't have to embrace the idea of God and of faith. But here's the thing, and again, you know this. The reality is the choices you have made and the choices I've made, they are not mistakes. You know what a mistake is? A mistake is, oops, I'm sorry, on the way out I accidentally bumped into you. I'm sorry, that's a mistake. A mistake is I was doing some math and I misadded some numbers. That's a mistake. What you did was not a mistake. What I did was not a mistake. It was sin. And we hate that word, don't we? We don't want to come to church and hear about sin. Because sin drives this idea. Sin forces us to acknowledge that the choice of the behavior you made was a deliberate choice. You deliberately chose to do something that hurt that other person. It wasn't a mistake. You deliberately chose to gossip. It wasn't an accident. You deliberately chose to rebel. You deliberately chose to resist. I deliberately chose to hurt their reputation. I deliberately chose to do that knowing it would break trust with them. It's not a mistake. It's sin. And none of us, come on, this is true for all of us, none of us want to deal with that. And none of us want to feel guilt because we have to own we intentionally made some choices to hurt some people and to offend God. And that's often what drives us to walk away. Along the same lines, if we embrace God, not only is there guilt, but if there's God, then I'm accountable. And good grief, I don't want to be accountable. I want to be able to call up my own shots. I want to be independent, and I want to be autonomous. I do not want to be accountable to anyone. I especially don't want to be accountable to God. But here's the reality of this. Even if you walk away from God to escape accountability, you do not escape accountability. You can't. You and I are always accountable. We're accountable to the people around us. We're accountable to the people we love. And whether we want to acknowledge it or not, we are accountable to our Creator for the choices that we make. Not only that, but I would argue that an unaccountable life leads to a life of regret. Isn't that true? You have watched some people in your life who have made choices as if they were unaccountable. And it filled them with regret, and it was not, the ramifications of those choices were not just contained to their life, were they? They spilled out onto the lives of all the people around them. Because unaccountability is not really an option for us. If there's God, I'm guilty. If there's God, man, I don't want to admit it, but I'm accountable. Autonomy is just an illusion. And then here's the third one, and maybe the hardest one of all. If there's God, then I don't even want to say that. All of you say it together. Ready? If there's God, then See, I've been trying to get you to admit you were wrong forever. There you go. I'm right, you're wrong. Some of you are going, I have never heard the person next to me say that until just now, Matt. It's like, holy cow. I mean, none of us want to admit this, right? None of us want to say this. Why? Because we're proud. Some of us more than others, but we're proud. I don't want to have to turn around and embrace God and admit that I'm wrong. But let me just get you to think about this for a second. Where does pride lead? Pride never leads to progress. You know what the way forward is? The way forward is the way of humility. You know this. Humility is what leads to wiser decisions. Humility is what leads to a better life. Humility is what leads to stronger relationships. And I don't know if you've ever thought about this before, but humility is the fastest route to the truth. It's the fastest route to the truth. But if we were honest, we would all admit we have had moments, and some of us are here right now, where we would rather be proud and wrong as be humble and right. It's just the reality of it. If I turn around and embrace God, if I walk back towards faith, then I have to acknowledge I'm guilty, I'm accountable, and I'm wrong. None of us want to do that. But listen, here's the thing. Acknowledging this, at least to yourself, if nobody else, acknowledging these three things puts you one step away from an extraordinary discovery. See, when you acknowledge these three things, you are one step away from discovering that history is an incredible story. The history is a story of a God who wants a relationship with you. That history is a story of a God who has been moving and proving his love for you. History is a story of a God who has been pursuing you, not to pay you back, but to win you back. And if what Jesus taught us about God is true, and there's a lot of evidence, there's plenty of evidence to convince us, we can trust him. If what Jesus taught us about God is true, then here's the beauty of this. We hear these things and it gets under our skin. We hear these things and it creates tension. We hear these things, and for some of you, and I get this, for some of you it just makes you argue in your head with me because you're like, I don't want to be a part of a church. I don't want to hear again the message that you're guilty and you're accountable and I'm wrong. It's like you move beyond that. I'm telling you, what Jesus taught us is extraordinary. Because for that tension, for that pushback, for that resistance and rebellion that tends to rise up in all of us, Jesus said, no. God provides a solution to all of this. You don't need to resist it. You don't need to be angry about it. You don't need to rebel against it, because there's a solution. See, here's what Jesus taught. Jesus taught if you turn around and embrace God, then there's forgiveness for your guilt. There is a solution to your guilt and mine. There is forgiveness. I don't know if you've ever thought of it this way, but your sin and my sin became the platform for God's greatest demonstration of love to us. Here's how Paul described this. He wrote this: but God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, while we were still in the middle of rebellion, while we were still resisting, Christ died. Paul said, for you and for me. He died for us. That Jesus did for us what we could not do for ourselves. He did not leave us in our guilt, but he died and rose again to pay the penalty for our sins, so forgiveness was available for all of us. Now just think about this. Whenever you commit an offense against someone, and this includes God, whenever you commit an offense against someone, it requires two things. Your offense requires the demands of justice be met, but your offense also requires forgiveness to restore the relationship. And the beauty of what God did through Jesus is on the cross, Jesus satisfied the demands of justice for the offenses we have committed against God. But he also offered forgiveness to restore the relationship and remove the guilt for our offenses. It was God's greatest, most sacrificial, powerful display of love. Jesus said, I want you to know, you're guilty, you're a sinner. But the story doesn't end there. Because when you turn around and embrace God, you find not condemnation or judgment, you find forgiveness. Which leads to the second thing Jesus taught. He said, if there's God, then there's relationship. Because forgiveness makes relationship possible. Again. See, to resist, don't miss this, to resist is to make impossible a relationship. To resist is to make impossible a relationship. Now, every parent knows this. Every parent knows with their child that rebellion breaks the relationship. Isn't that true? Rebellion always breaks a relationship. To resist or rebel against that parent is to remove the ability to have the kind of relationship you were intended to have. Jesus looked at us and said, you are accountable to your heavenly Father. This is important. You are not accountable to a judge. Because if you turn around and embrace your heavenly Father, you're then accountable, not to a judge, but to your Father. But if you resist him, you resist the relationship. If you rebel against him, you break the relationship. But when you embrace him, you find forgiveness for your guilt. And you find relationship with a Father, not a judge, with a Father to whom you are accountable. And then third, Jesus taught this, that if there's God, then there's truth. Here's why this matters so much. Because yes, you have made choices where you are wrong, and so have I. But truth means we can know what's right. Truth means there's an objective standard of right and wrong, that what's wrong for you and what's wrong for me is the same thing. That it can't be wrong for you and right for me, and everybody just makes up their own rules. There's an objective standard, as we talked about last week. Jesus said there is a moral law. There's a sense of ought to and ought not to that goes beyond whatever the laws of your land are. There's a sense of ought to and ought not to that all of us know this is how another human being should be treated. This is not how they ought to be treated. And it is true for all people, in all places, in all times. We don't have to wonder. We don't have to guess. Now, this truth means there are times when we're wrong, but it also means we know what's right. It also means we know what's true, and what's true can guide us to a better life. And as we talked about last week, because truth exists, there is a basis for justice for all one day. So Jesus said, hey, before you want to resist and rebel because you don't want to deal with guilt and accountability and admitting you're wrong, you got to understand I came so there could be forgiveness, relationship, and truth. So if the question was, who wants God? If we were all honest, the answer to that question would be none of us. At least at some point in our lives, none of us want God because we have all rebelled and we have all resisted. But if the question is who needs God, then there can be no other answer than everybody. I don't know if you're aware of this, but Jesus had brothers and sisters, and we know a little bit about these brothers and sisters because they are referenced a few times in the accounts of the stories of Jesus' life. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they all wrote accounts of Jesus' life, and they all reference these brothers and sisters of Jesus. We even know a few of them by name. One of Jesus' brothers was named James, became the most famous of them all. Now, here's what's interesting when you begin to read the gospel stories. You find that as Jesus went about for 3 years preaching, teaching, and healing, his biggest skeptics were his brothers and his sisters. That's really not surprising, is it? What would it take for your brother or sister to convince you that they were the Son of God? Nothing short of a resurrection. That's what it would take. And even then, you'd be like, I got to double check that. They were skeptical, understandably so. They did not believe. Jesus would teach, and they would, argue about what he taught. He would claim he was God in human flesh. They would debate it with him. He would perform a miracle, and they would say, we're not impressed. They'd grown up with him. It took the resurrection for his brothers and sisters to actually believe. Now imagine what it took for James and the rest of his siblings after the resurrection to look at Jesus, to look him in the eye, and to admit, we were wrong. Okay, we've been fighting against you, and we've been arguing, we've been telling all the crowds not to buy into all this. Okay, we were wrong. How much humility did it have to take for James to say, you're now my Savior, to his brother, to say, you're now my leader, and I'm going to follow you and submit to you and what you say for the rest of my life. But that's what he did. And God honored that humility, and James eventually became the point leader of that first church that met there in Jerusalem. And James was a leader of that church until about AD 62 or 63. And you know what happened then? There was a high priest at the time in Jerusalem, a high priest by the name of Ananias. And Ananias found his moment. He found his opportunity when Rome removed one of the Roman governors over the area, and they had yet to place another Roman governor, and there was no Roman rule in place on the premises. And so Ananias saw his opportunity, and he stepped in when there was no authority there from Rome, and he called the Sanhedrin together, which was the religious ruling body in Jerusalem. And Ananias said, now is our chance. We've been trying to shut James up so he would quit telling people that he saw his brother die and rise again. Now is our chance to put an end to it. And they arrested James illegally. It was completely illegal according to their law. But they arrested James. Some Jewish and Roman historians actually say they took him up to the top of the temple and they threw him off the top of the temple. It did not kill him, and all historians from that period agree. They all write about it. That James was then stoned to death because he wouldn't stop telling people his brother had died and risen again. But before he died, James wrote a letter to Jewish Christians explaining to them what it meant to embrace and to follow Jesus. And I want to read you, I thought there was no better way to end this series than to read you what James wrote, because this applies to all of us when it comes to reevaluating or reconsidering faith. Here's what James said. Come near to God, and he will come near to you. Now, I'm just guessing as he wrote that. He was thinking about all those times he'd been skeptical of miracles. All those times he had resisted Jesus. All those times he had been under the same roof with God in human flesh, and he wouldn't believe. And so he writes and he says, listen, if you just come near, if I had just come near sooner, God will come near to you. Well, what's it mean to come near, James? Well, he tells us. He says, wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Now, this is figurative language. This is James' way of saying, here's how you come near to God. You stop labeling everything in your life as a mistake, and you own the fact that you are a sinner who has not only offended others but offended God. And you stop making arguments to other people as to why you walked away and why you resist when really you know in your heart. You just don't want to admit you're guilty. You don't admit you're accountable. You don't want to admit you're wrong. You stop being double-minded and you own it. And then James gives us what is the toughest advice of all. He says, humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. How do you come near to God, James? How do you reevaluate? How do you reconsider? How do you figure out who the God of Jesus is? James says you've got to humble yourself. And when you humble yourself, you will find something extraordinary happens. God will show up in unexpected ways to guide you, to reveal himself to you, and to lift you up. So as we close, I have one simple question for you. Will you do that? Will you humble yourself and reevaluate, reconsider, walk back towards, and examine again the God of Jesus? For some of you, it means this. Will you humble yourself enough just to come back next week, to come back the week after, to come back the week after, to re-engage with church and begin to explore? For some of you, it means will you humble yourself enough to open up a Bible again and to read Matthew's account, Mark's account, Luke's account, John's account, and ask yourself, okay, what does Jesus teach me about who God really is? For some of you, it means you have to humble yourself enough to admit, I don't have it all figured out, and I'm not sure I've got all the answers. It's worth asking some other people to explain all the hang-ups I've got. It's worth re-examining whether there are answers to some of the questions that have never been answered for me satisfactorily. But maybe I should explore. Maybe I should listen. Maybe I should see if there's more than what I've been told. For some of you, it means humbling yourself enough to get in one of our starting point groups and surrounding yourself with some other seekers and starters and returners and asking your questions and exploring faith in community. For all of us, I hope it will mean this. I hope you will be willing to pray a very simple prayer. Father, I'm willing to learn, and I'm open to change. For some of you, you've been exploring for a while, and your prayer needs to move beyond that because you know you need to embrace the God of Jesus. For you, your prayer needs to be, Father, I know I'm guilty. I know I'm accountable. And I know I'm wrong. And so I ask for your forgiveness. I want a relationship with you. And I'm going to live my life by your truth. I'm going to follow Jesus. That's what it means to be a Christian. And some of you need to step across the line and make that decision today. Will you humble yourself enough to take your next step in your adult journey of faith? In just a minute as we close, I'm going to get the band to come back out, and I've asked them to perform a song, and the reason I want them to do this is because I wanted to create a moment for all of us to reflect, hopefully to pray, to consider, and ultimately my desire is that you will choose in these next few moments to take your next step to reevaluate and reconsider Jesus, whatever that step is, but choose humility. Because when you humble yourself, he will show up. Let me pray for us. Father, we are all guilty of self-deception. We're all guilty of convincing ourselves, convincing other people that there's more to the decisions we made, when in reality, we just don't admit that we're accountable, that we're guilty, that we're wrong. So for those here who need to take a step of humility, they know they need to turn around, reevaluate, reconsider, begin again an adult journey of faith, exploring who you are. Would you give them the courage in these next few moments to take that step and to demonstrate that kind of extraordinary humility?